Everyone see that okay?
Yes, we can see that fine. And we can hear you fine.
We're using a combination of technologies today, so just bear with us. And I think I'm right in saying it's the first time that the guys have had two presenters on a webinar, so we hope that will go smoothly anyway. So just so everyone that's attended today, we really appreciate your time. If you're based in the UK, I know it's incredible weather out, so you know, to give up your lunchtime to go and listen to Richard and I talk rather than get out in the sun, we really appreciate that. So as Nancy said, this is an introduction to mental health in online communities. Of course, what we can't do today is, you know, delve in any great detail to particular parts of that. What we're looking to do really is talk about mental health, how it applies to online communities, but also touch on community managers. And I think it's fair to say that both Richard and I have seen in various things we've been at, the need for community managers to be able to discuss this stuff. I think a lot of community managers feel isolated. We use the term sometimes Lone Ranger, you know, in trying to deal with their communities and how it affects them, and we'll kind of cover that in a bit. So, in terms of what we're going to do today, obviously Rich and I will just introduce ourselves, tell you who we are and why you should care. You might not afterwards, but hopefully you will. Quick icebreaker, just to get to know a bit more about you guys and, you know, what you do. I think it's important we kind of define what is mental health. You know, the term gets bandied around quite a lot at the moment, and it's obviously really important. And I think support for it is getting a lot stronger. But just to sort of define what we're talking about and why it's relevant. And then we'll kind of touch on that division between communities and community managers. You know, when we talk about support for communities, sometimes we don't necessarily talk about the fact there is a community and there's a community team. And those two things have complementary, but sometimes very specific needs. We're going to talk a little bit about the bedside manner of communities. So, you know, sometimes when we live in a world of data and we live in the big picture, the attention to detail can be lost because we sometimes don't have time or we don't think about it. We're going to talk about the power of the personal message, which is kind of connected to bedside manner. And I'm going to show you an example about how that works. Talk a bit about moderation, and then the bit about self-care for community managers. And then we'll just kind of round off with some resources and Q&A. And as Nancy said also, we want this to be a very open session, a kind of round table feel to it. So please populate the chat window with questions. We'll pause every few slides just to see if there are any questions. We want to make sure this is, you know, you get to ask as much as you can. You know, we won't have every single answer, but we want to make sure that we give you as much information as possible, and also to connect people that are on the webinar. So hopefully that all made sense. And we will have a little section at the end, which is just, you know, isolated the Q&A, and we'll spend a bit of time just listening to what happens in the chat. So I'll just hand over to Richard to introduce himself briefly.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Richard Graham. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist by training. And I guess here, because not only have young people always been at the cutting edge of using tech, but apart from work for the Internet Safety Council in the UK, UKIS, I'd have been interested for some time, and way back in 2009 took on a role that was pretty much close to being clinical director for an online support platform for people with mental health needs in the NHS, Big White Wall, which is still running. I spent a lot of time thinking about and working out how to support and train those working in the community to support the users. That's enough.
Thanks, Richard. So just to myself, some of you may know me through community management circles, but my background, I've got over 15 years of experience building communities and digital strategy. My original background was for a company in the United Kingdom called Money Saving Expert, which began from a standing start and became the biggest independent journalistic money website in the UK. Huge community of 1.5 million highly active members, which brought its own challenges and quite a steep learning curve. I then went to work with Nancy, a company called Fever Bee that I'm sure some of you will be familiar with, and sort of took a stand on the other side of the fence, helping companies build community strategy. So sort of worked globally with a lot of household names on that. And now I work for myself, for my own company, Island 23, who are a community consultancy, of which my main client is the National Health Service in the UK and Public Health England. And we're working primarily on the Good Thinking initiative, which is set out by the London Mayor's Office. And as part of that strategy, it's to help use what the NHS called peer-to-peer, we would refer to as community, to sort of help solve some of the mental health challenges and, you know, sort of lower costs and drive awareness throughout people that might need the services through Good Thinking and, you know, London and wider in the UK as well. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of context about who we are. Did you just put a poll up, Nancy?
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay, that's fine. You're enthusiastic, I like that.
I was too eager.
Eager beaver, we like that. So just as a quick icebreaker, and if you can just give us a few minutes of your time. We've got a quick poll up here. Just want to get a sense really of the experience that you guys have got. These are very broad categories, you can't kind of cover every nuance, but you can just take a few minutes now, or a few seconds rather, just to indicate where you sit, or just give us a sense of who our audience is today. I'll just give you sort of 10-15 seconds to do that.
Yeah, so we found from previous webinars that this is so helpful, not only for the presenters to know who's on the line, but also to know what company you're in and what sort of experience are the other people that are interested in this topic. So first asking, like, do you support an online community? How, it's all, confidential. No one knows, it's just a quick poll. And then how long have you been looking after them? So we know, you're a newbie or have you had loads of experience, just to get a rough feel. And then what is the size of your community? So if everyone has had a chance to vote now, I'm going to close the poll and then share the results. So now I will share. So hopefully you can all see that now. So the majority looks like look after one. And then the majority have had over 5 years experience. That's fantastic that you're all with us today. And then some really big scale communities, people responsible for some really large communities. So that's fantastic insight. Thank you for sharing those. I will, maybe it'll be useful to know what kind of communities, but I'll ask that in the chat, Darren, and let you carry on. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be nice to know a bit more detail around that, but thanks everyone for taking a few seconds to answer that. Do I need to close the poll, Nancy, or is that you?
I think it's closed now for the viewers, unless anyone can still see it. Let me know.
Okay, let's hope not. So what I'll do now is I'll just you get to not listen to my roguish dulcet tones for a few minutes. I'll just hand over to Richard, who's the doctor here, so definitely pay attention to him. Richard's going to talk a little bit more about what mental health is. So Richard.
Thanks, Darren. Yeah, we thought it might be interesting for everyone to take a step back and think about what mental health is. And I must confess for myself, it surprised me looking a few years back at how the World Health Organization defined it, because many of us would go around thinking about symptoms, about depression, anxiety, stress, OCD, very much the mental disorder side of things, without actually thinking about what mental health is. And so it's really helpful to grasp this, because it means that everyone, no matter what they're struggling with, has an opportunity to improve their mental health and, in a sense, also their mental well-being. So just to take the first World Health Organization definition, mental health is defined as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential. So it's very much about sort of removing those obstacles to achieving what you can. And that's why I think so many things that are oppressive in communities, offline as well as online, of course, are about blocking and oppressing people in ways where they can't show themselves, as well as the world, their better side, their potential. And of course, from that, you're going to be much more resilient and able to cope with the stresses of life, get into that benign cycle where you can work productively and fruitfully, not just in the workplace, but in all areas. And again, get those rewards and opportunities that give you a sense of making a contribution to your community. So it's a really nice sort of way of capturing the domains that we can work on that will improve mental health. Similarly, well-being and mental health and mental well-being are often interchangeable, is a very similar description, but with an emphasis on relationships as well. And if we take it a step further, mental well-being is enhanced when you have a clear sense of purpose and value within your own society. So again, for those that feel marginalized, and it's really interesting to start applying this to online communities, people then struggle, and one can see how negative behaviors and difficulties arise. So in short, mental well-being can be defined as feeling good and functioning well. It's an interesting emphasis again on functioning, again being able to do things, or a person who works well, loves well and expects well, notwithstanding profound life adversities. So whatever your situation, there are opportunities to improve things for yourself, and being active in that key to feeling good. And I don't want to be glib about that. I mean, lots of people have real difficulties they're struggling with, but doing something about it, working on that, etc., can all lead to those small changes that lead to bigger ones. So, in a sense, what we're saying is mental health problems do not have an impact through the mental distress, through something like anxiety or a low mood, but also because of the way they disrupt your work, your relationships, and those capacities to achieve something in life and feel you're contributing. So hopefully that's an interesting way of thinking about this for you, because it really is about putting back into all of our hands the opportunities to improve these things. And that's why this slide, which I've borrowed from a colleague at Public Health England, Gregor Henderson, who changed my mind considerably about thinking about mental health, about seeing well-being as something that even people with illnesses can have. You can have a mental illness, but be supported in your workplace, in your family, in your relationships, and so on, in a way where, again, you've got some opportunities to achieve and manage stress better in a way that gives you a greater sense of mental well-being. You can flourish despite even something like a mental illness. And of course, that applies to physical health as well. And conversely, of course, you can be very unhappy and be languishing even without a mental disorder that would contribute to that. So these are things that, you know, really contribute both in terms of public health and our wider thinking about how we can all make a difference. So I think at that incredibly optimistic moment, Darren, I think I hand back to you.
Thanks, Richard. So let's just talk a little bit about communities and community managers themselves. So I think they're two sides of the same coin, but I think it's important we kind of look at the sort of areas we deal with here. So, you know, when you work in your community, in my experience, and certainly the experience of a lot of community managers, mental health issues occur in the most unexpected places. You know, my background for 10 years was running a money community, and the levels of anxiety and stress and just bleakness that caused at times was, you know, unexpected to us, but we had to learn and deal with it. And I suspect that happens in a lot of communities. You know, members expect every post to be treated as urgent. There's this, you know, this concept that, you know, because it's there, you have to deal with it instantly. They have no concept of what the team involves, what kind of structure you've got in place. And obviously the threat of trolls we have is ever present to our challenge. You know, we have a range of tools to try and deal with them. And that's not just from the logistical back end point of view, but in terms of, you know, our bedside manner, you know, the way we kind of interact with our communities. And there's a few things that I think a lot of community managers struggle with. The biggest one really is, like, do other community managers deal with this? The short answer is yes, of course they do. But, you know, when you're working in isolation, and I think for a lot of community managers, you know, the profession is relatively new, you know, when you compare it to things like legal or marketing. So there's always that sense of, you know, am I alone here? Where do I go for help? And if those community managers do deal with this, you know, what actions are they taking? Are we kind of being consistent in terms of how we deal with our community? You know, some of our community members possibly frequent a number of these communities. Are they getting a consistent experience in the way that their challenges are being dealt with? You know, how are we fair but firm? You know, it's okay to be to try and be everything to everyone, but ultimately, you know, you have to manage your community effectively. You have to make sure that, you know, the greater good is being taken care of. And, you know, just that question, what can I do? You know, I'm one community manager, I'm a small community team. You know, what is it that I can do to make a difference? And then, you know, to sort of bring on from that, you know, you as a community manager, you know, I know it feels like you're always on. It always feels like, you know, you might finish work. There might be a finish time, but you take those problems home with you in the evening. You wake up at 4 a.m. because it's racing on your mind the whole time. You know, where does your personal responsibility start and finish? You know, whilst you might have, you know, 9 to 5 hours or 8 to 6 or whatever, you know, for a lot of industries, you know, whilst a lot of people obviously work beyond those, I think for community managers especially, the community is 24/7. You know, it very rarely goes off. Community managers just find it hard to put these kind of parameters in place. You know, how do you keep senior stakeholders on side? The amount of stories I've heard from people that, you know, have very little communication with, you know, quite influential people in an organisation who have kind of heard of this community thing and they think it's a good idea and, you know, other people are doing it, so we should definitely do it. But they don't always understand exactly what it takes to deal with a community. And then, you know, through maybe another channel, they hear of something that's happened. You know, maybe you've had to block an account, you've had to deal with an issue. It's not unusual for them to kind of come storming in, you know, what's happened here, and they have no backstory. So how do we kind of deal with that? How do we cover our community 24/7? You know, moderation is a big part of this. unless you're turning your community off at 5, which, no one does. How do we deal with that? That kind of feeling that I'm alone and I'm dealing with this. Now, I'll put a hyperlink here to a blog I wrote. The blog's called Community Managers as Lone Rangers. We may choose to do a webinar about that in the future, more directly on that. We'll maybe talk about that in the Q&A. But if you get a second, maybe just go and have a look at that and see what you think. I think it will resonate with a lot of you. And then this kind of idea of burnout, I just feel like I can't maintain this 24/7. I can't do this week after week where, at the start I'm enthusiastic and I want to make sure I've got a great community. I want to make sure my company feels like I'm doing a great job. But, as one human being, we are human beings here. Without good moderation, we can't deal with this, without burning out eventually. And then there's that other question as well, how do I upskill to deal with this better? Certainly in my history, with Money Saving Expert, I started that job before community was even the profession it is today. So, where do I go to get those skills? How do I become better and more effective at what I'm doing? So, for some of you, I've been through sort of a few things that I think are important there. And this may be like a hallelujah moment. I think for a lot of people who are on this call or interested in this topic, there does feel like isolation. There is that stress. And it may just be that sense of connecting people sometimes, has just already kind of lifted a bit of weight. Someone else gets it. Someone else understands what's going on here. And just, thank the Lord that this is something that other people deal with. So I want to move on a little bit into bedside manner. I think bedside manner is quite often a forgotten art with communities. There's a graphic here about just shut up and take the lollipop. But we kind of swim in this world of data at the moment, and data's everywhere, and it's incredible. We deal with dashboards, we deal with just a plethora of ways that we can evaluate our community. We can put measures on KPIs, look at return on investment. But I think sometimes that kind of blinds us to the needs of the individual. It's all too common when things get difficult to go kind of straight for the nuke button, whether that's block, ban, stop. But it's quite a dangerous precedent, and it does cause a lot of anxiety. Rich and I have been to events where community managers have spoken about that being the first thing to do, and it kind of worries us a little bit. And an example that, funny enough, the CEO of the Joe Cox Foundation, which in the UK probably means a bit more than if you've come from the West Coast. But she had this kind of analogy of like whacking moles at the start. And I think it's kind of apt. So, you kind of try and whack as many moles as you can, but actually they get, annoyed. The community doesn't cope very well, and they just keep popping up in other places. Resource issues, the goodwill of the community gets damaged, and ultimately the communities, do suffer. And I think, a lot of communities don't really have a moderation policy that's fair and easy to understand. And especially not when it comes to what members are aware of. You might have written your terms and conditions. You might have a nice page somewhere that's your house rules. You might even try and get it into the sign-up process. But I think, kind of bringing that to the front and centre sometimes, just reminding members of what your policy is, helping members to understand what's expected of them, what their behaviour should be in the community, and how we work together in our community to make it better for the good of everyone that, wants to take value out of what we're doing here. And, community managers, again, don't often set expectations of themselves and also their team, with the community members. We might grow our little teams, so we might have, great moderations policies, but how do we convert that stuff into a way that's manageable for the team? How do we show what we're doing in the back end is understood by the front end? How do we make sure the team are happy? How do we create feedback channels so that the team can let us know as community managers what's going on the communities, and just sort of make it so there's a lot of clarity in terms of the way we deal with things, and members don't just feel like you're going to go for that nuke button, or that they're being lost in a sea of data and they're not important as individuals. And that for me is where I think at the moment there's a bit of forgotten art in terms of how we deal with that. And as part of that, I think the personal message, again, goes a long way. It's something that a lot of communities don't always use enough. And I'm going to give you an example now about, this is a real world example of something we used at Money Saving Expert. And this is just, it uses the actual platform itself, the personal message. So it doesn't even get into emails or, the moderation system. It's just a really simple message. It just says, hi, whoever you are, Joe Blogs. And the language is really important. So we've noticed you don't seem like I've noticed you don't seem like your usual self at the moment. Just wanted to get in touch and see if everything was okay. Let me know if I can help. And then obviously sign off with your name, not just community manager or something that's a little bit impersonal. But look at the language there. I notice you don't seem like you use yourself. You're not presenting blame. You're not creating it as a problem. And this, again, is not exactly verbatim, but a real world example. And just the reply is, hi, Darren. Thanks for getting in touch. The truth is I lost my job 2 weeks ago and it's gotten me down. It's affected my mental health. when I've been aggressive on the community, I'll try and tone it down. Your note means a lot. And I would say in probably 60-70% of cases, we sent this PM out. This was the kind of response we got. We always forget sometimes that, that expression that, everyone has problems you don't always see. It's true, problems with job, at home, any kind of stresses manifest themselves sometimes through online community. But just that personal touch of reaching out and connecting with people, it can kind of stop a lot of problems at source. And a lot of these people actually, in my experience, have gone on to become ambassadors because you took the time to create a personal connection with them. Through word of mouth, they then tell other users that this is what happened, and they were really appreciative. But now they've turned from being someone that could create problems in your community or is disruptive to someone that's now, almost a brand ambassador to you. Like, they were so grateful that this was a person. And that's the other thing. You're reminding them that as a community manager, you're a person behind the scenes. You're not just the community manager. You're not the staff. You're not the boss. You're a real person that's trying to connect with them on a personal level. So I think the power of the personal message is something as a key takeaway, that if you're not using it right now and you're not using this type of language to communicate with people, can be really important. And the other thing is, I think the kind of fair escalation system. So if the PM level isn't working for you, I think, we talked earlier about making moderation systems connect with people in a way that they understand. So there's kind of a couple of examples here, the kind of the traffic light system, the red, green, amber, and at MSc we use the analogy of the football card system, same sort of things, but it's taking a moderation system that can feel a little bit archaic and a bit cumbersome, and it's connecting people with people in a way that makes sense to them. And here's a process I think that most people would benefit from using. So, never go straight for the ban unless it's unlawful. So you obviously use your discretion with unlawful. And by unlawful, we typically mean things like, racism, sexism, xenophobia, things that, in real life that we wouldn't tolerate. I think use your discretion there, because if people are coming on and using that kind of what you might call hate language, that is the type of thing we just don't want to see in our communities at all. But the first step should always be that reach out personally and try and connect on a genuine human-to-human level. Use the PM. By all means, take my PM example there and see what kind of reaction you get. The next thing is to use the power of your super users. Now, depending on what size of the community you have, some of you might have no super users, some of you might be trying to grow this group, some of you might have an incredible amount of super users. At MSc, we ran a community of 1.5 million people with 7 staff. And the reason we were able to do that so effectively is that for every board and subboard we had 3 or 4 super users that had a few extra powers that could, kind of help us monitor what was going on, do some very basic admin, some very basic moderation stuff that didn't allow them to ban or do anything too drastic. But the reason I've highlighted super users in a circle when it comes to mental health is, remember that these people are also at risk of suffering from mental health problems as well. Just because they're very effective, they're very vocal in the community, they seem like they're very helpful, very productive, it doesn't mean they can't suffer from mental health problems. So it's really important that whether you create a space in your community where you can kind of give them a private area they can talk and they can connect with the team, spend some time reaching out to them on a one-to-one level. Just really make sure that you keep track of what these guys are doing as well and that they're fully supported. Because if any of these guys start to, display traits of mental health problems, that can feed through the super user group quite quickly and it can become quite disruptive. So it's really important to keep an eye on that as well. If you have to get into the sort of warning stages, so what you might call the amber traffic light or the yellow card, warn, but use very positive help language, a bit like our PM. Make sure it's sort of the tone of it is very much around, this doesn't seem like your usual self, or what can we do to help? Make sure it always gives people an escalation. As human beings, we don't like being told we're wrong. We don't like being told we're a problem, even if we are being a problem. And usually any type of kind of confrontation causes the user themselves to, either disappear completely or they usually fight back. So make sure we use very positive help language to get them on side, just to understand if there is an underlying problem, what it is and how we can help. And then this point I think is really important. If you've been through your options and you've exhausted everything, signpost those people to areas you think might be able to help them. And we'll give some examples later of what those might be. But never be afraid to stop the account if it gets to the stage where you've been through your levels and they're being more disruptive. Because as it says at the end, don't be afraid to protect your community. If we talk about the greater good, you have to get to a point where as a community manager, you have a shut-off line. And I think I've seen a lot of communities run where people are terrified to sort of use the ban hammer, stop an account from posting, to do these type of things. And the reason a lot of the time that people are worried is firstly the effects on the community. Well, I think if you've made your escalation system fair and obvious, for a lot of people, they'll understand there has to come a line where that's, like, goes beyond the pale. But also this part on the right-hand side about keeping good records. You know, we talked earlier about how we deal with stakeholders and how those people, you know, sometimes can come in having not understood the situation and, you know, why have you banned this person? Why have you done this? A lot of community managers don't keep good records. You might think you do. You might think that there's stuff in the system, but literally just showing that you've been through all the stages that you agree as a community affair and as a company or as an organisation, or even as a hobbyist community, you feel are fair to people. Make sure you can show your train of thought. Make sure you show you've given people every opportunity you can through the moderation system to help. And if you can do that, I think, you know, within an organisation, most people would accept that you've done your job as a community manager. And when it helps us manage our mental health as community managers, that's really important as well. You know, it helps you have some closure on what you've done. It helps you show your organisation or even the rest of your community, you know, you've done things that are fair and are seen to be fair, and also you've kept good records. You can show that you've done that properly and effectively. So I'll just hand back to Richard for a little now to talk about it all starts with. Richard?
Yeah, I've noticed from the chat that I think some of the people on the webinar have experience of mental health first aid. I'm going to talk about two things. One is supporting people in your community who may be in difficulty, may even be in crisis, and then think about how you care for yourself and support yourself in that context. And this is some material that the Mental Health Foundation developed in relation to supporting people in the workplace. And as Darren was saying, it absolutely does start with asking someone how they're doing in a warm and authentic way, which I think you would have picked up from the message, the personal message that he sent earlier in the slides. So how do you do that? Well, I think, as Darren's just said, you're just preempting most of my slides. It's almost as if you've seen them before. Time and place. You've got to do it online in a space where it can be private. It might be private messaging, some sort of way of structuring the community, so there are those spaces where you can have that discreet private conversation, because the last thing you want to do is humiliate someone by taking things up in public. Second, active listening. Interesting that when we're offline, we've got a whole range of ways of conveying that we're listening, with everything from nods to noises and words, questions that sort of convey that you are following. How can you do that online? How can you give them a sense that you really are attentive? Again, brief little questions or queries might convey some of that, but we'll all have our own style about doing that. Trying to stay as neutral as possible and manage any surprise or judgmental feelings, even around areas where you might consider the risks are considerable. Not trying to offer solutions too quickly, because they may just want someone to listen. They may just want space. And you know, when you ask them what they want to happen, they might say, "This is enough, thanks." But often the elephant in the room is that there's a worry that someone might be acutely at risk, maybe having suicidal thoughts. And I think, you know, there are different approaches to this, but there is more and more evidence coming from those with lived experience of having felt suicidal, that being asked directly is really helpful. The sort of trying not to pussyfoot and sort of come out with sort of phrases like "you wouldn't do something silly" is not so helpful. But of course, you've got to again find a way that works for you. And quite interestingly, you know, the Mental Health Foundation research has shown that 20% of people have gone into work whilst experiencing suicidal thoughts. So I think it's probably part of the way we're able to talk about these things online as anything else. We're recognizing more and more people can feel bad in that way. So someone who can ask those questions and then know how to signpost them to the right level of help is going to be a great support to that person. So if we flip to the next slide, there's a list of resources there that you might want to take note of. There's a page from the Samaritans on how to hold difficult conversations, and also links to the wider website. And I think if you are in your work going to signpost the Samaritans, it's worth having a look and seeing what that person might realistically expect from contacting them, whether it's through their online processes or the telephone call. For people in the US, there's some really nice content from the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And other areas, I mean, this isn't massively populated, as Darren said, we could go on for hours on each of these areas. Areas like domestic violence, domestic abuse, you know, really tricky. There's some great content on NHS Choices. Now it's been rebranded. That actually is a great way of signposting to somebody who's not even aware that clearly about what they're living through and with. So they're just a few tips. There's much more we could do in this space. But obviously when you've been through that, you may be feeling a bit shaken yourself. And so one of the things that we do absolutely think of as key to your role of community manager is how you look after yourself and how you prioritize that. And really, if you take the same approach to your mental health and well-being as you might going to the gym and your physical health with diet and activity, you know, we should be thinking in exactly the same way about mental health, and scheduling and sticking to, you know, commitments in this space is probably in itself very helpful to your mental health. If others are putting you under pressure, you know, showing that you can look after yourself is a really good thing. So these are the different domains. Talk about your feelings, being able to share with people you trust, again, perhaps confidentially at times, staying physically active, but also I think mentally active as well, making sure you're doing the things that are important to you, eating well. Drinking sensibly is not just about water, it's about alcohol. And I think, unfortunately, the way this is phrased, it suggests those of you who are teetotal, you're going to have to start opening a few bottles. Keep in touch is again, maintaining your relationships and really prioritizing those. You need them. You need people in your life to be there for you or just to have fun with. Ask for help. None of us are superhuman. We all do need to know what our limitations are when it's time to reach out to others. Breaks are essential. Holidays, sort of non-online time, etc. Lots to be said there. Remembering to make sure you've got time in your life to be doing the things that you're good at. I don't know, as community managers, whether it can feel always that you're doing a good job when the people you're helping may be under enormous pressures. And then it's back to being realistic and accepting who you are and actually being quite compassionate about the fact that we're all human with our vulnerabilities as well as our skills and knowledge. And then finally, and you know, this is probably for the important people in your life, I think, really those small acts of generosity and kindness, caring for others, you know, key part of well-being that you shouldn't neglect. But this doesn't mean staying in your communities 24/7, working like a dog. Some of whom we have on the webinar, I believe.
I'm going to stop you there. I'm going to do a quick poll.
Oh, yeah, sorry, Nancy. Yep.
Sorry to interrupt. So
drink sensibly.
you can drink sensibly. So from reviewing this, we thought it would be good to sort of get a feel for what sort of things you're currently doing, maybe just looking back at the last 7 days. Have you made a point of doing any of these things? And then looking ahead, maybe from listening to what Richard's just been saying, maybe there's 1 or 2 things there you're going to focus on and maybe make a point of doing. So just want to, it's a good sense check, listening to the content, what connects with you and what you might do differently afterwards. So it's open there with the things that they recommend. While people are voting, just to say, guys, you've got a real mixture of people on the call today, from UX design community, software design, and then on the other spectrum, the sort of health, bereavement and wellness. So mixture. And everyone got quite excited when we started talking about banning, but then the sensitivity around, you know, obviously if people are feeling vulnerable, how you might deal with that differently to someone who's at, you know, just being a bit of a pain. But I think the liking of the personal message to start there is a really good place to start. Right, if everyone could finish their votes, I'm going to close the poll. What do they say on Eurovision or on X Factor? I'm going to close the poll now, and I'm going to share with you.
Are you being Dermot, Nancy?
Yeah, I'm not very well though. And I'm going to share. Right, lots Lots of mixture here. So looking back on the last 7 days, people are eating well the most. Second to that, is keeping active. Yes, especially in working with a computer. I know myself, if you don't, you can spend hours just hunched over the laptop. And then looking ahead, what we're going to do differently or maybe do more of is do something you're good at. That struck a chord. That didn't come up so well. 35% in the past week, but now 60%, and then keeping active, sort of staying on those. So really interesting there. I hope that's made you all have a little think about your own self-care. Thank you, Richard, for letting me interrupt you there, and I'll hand back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. I mean, I noticed that one of the lowest was asking for help, which I guess is not only why we're here, but also about how we can all get into that situation where we feel we should be taking on more than anyone realistically should. So, so if we go back to, and you did put it in yellow, Darren, that asked for help, important. So,
so those are the 3 things I thought might come up for community managers they maybe don't do enough of which ask for help is kind of a key one. So it was interesting to see that maybe reflected a bit in the poll as well.
Yeah, and I realised what was missing for me that is more and more important is actually getting a good night's sleep as well. And on Good Thinking, we've got a partnership with Sleepio, which is a self-help program to help people sleep better. So if I was to try and summarise my advice to all of you as community managers or those working in communities more broadly, is don't be an expert, don't take on responsibility for things that none of us can completely know. And also assessing risk online is extraordinarily difficult because there's so much you always don't know. It's pretty bad offline, but it's, I think, significantly harder online. So don't take on the burden, even if you've got lived experience of some of the things your members are talking about. Don't be a therapist. Don't start getting into situations. And for those of you, I know there's some training in counselling or maybe trained counsellors or psychologists on the webinar. If you get involved in a certain way with people and they then start to expect more that you can't possibly deliver, they get angry and upset and probably more risky as a result. So really being clear about what you can do in your community, and again, kind of being as ordinary and normal as possible in that sense. And then finally, again, when burnout is calling, don't fall into becoming too reflexive or a machine where you're kind of processing rather than taking in. That's a warning sign really to be working on your own well-being, I think, at that point. But I absolutely understand that some of you are going to be working with highly vulnerable groups and the toll on you is going to be significant. Take disclosures at face value and signpost. Again, it goes back to that issue of risk. If someone's disclosing suicidal thoughts or even an abusive, exploitative situation, make sure you've got in your armory the places you can signpost them to and nudge and encourage them to go down that road. And where I think we might be sort of moving in terms of asking for help is if, looking forwards, there are spaces where people can start to share a bit more what is happening for community managers, moderators, because really a lot of the research on internet psychology, if that's what it still is based on self-reported surveys, really, rather than what people like yourself know from seeing what people not just say or post, but what they're actually doing in their behavior. So we've all got lots to learn, and I think that will also help us reduce those obstacles for getting help at the right time. So I'll stop there, Darren, and it's back to you. Oh, and there's some resources.
Yeah, so there's just a list of, so these sort of go beyond the resources earlier. So the one at the top is the programme that Rich Darren are involved in. Mentalhealth.org.uk, those guys are fantastic as well. Some of these names will be familiar, I'm sure, but hopefully there's a few resources there that are definitely worth looking at. So the one that's missing, and Rich just sort of alluded to it there, is actually a space for community managers to talk about this kind of stuff. Now, they do exist. I mean, there's some fantastic companies out there that do provide spaces for community managers to talk. In my experience, a lot of the time, they're about building your community, which of course is vitally important, and the nuances of engagement and return on investment. And those guys do an incredible job at that. Fever Bee, CMX, all those type of guys standing on giants. For me, though, I think there's a gap for bringing community managers together to be able to talk about some of these issues that affect us, in the sort of mental health arena. So some of the work that Richard and I are doing with the NHS is on exactly this issue. It's to sort of work on creating a space where we can come and talk about these. And also, I think for community managers, being able to tell their stories, is something that we don't always do enough of. Richard and I were at an event the other week, and the idea was that people would get up and ask questions to the panel, but a lot of the time people were just really desperate to sort of share an experience and share a story because it's cathartic. But also they want to know, how do other people deal with this sort of stuff? So I think that's something that we can work on. When we finish this webinar, please do come along to Richard and Michael's group. Nancy and Michael's group, if you're not already a member. Come and ask further questions in there. Richard and I will happily give our time, the next few weeks and beyond to sort of see what we can do to help. One thing that Richard and I are doing as well at the end of March is we're going to bring together community managers in a kind of a round table setting, but actually at a venue where we kind of, an extension of this webinar, we talk about some of these issues and get community managers to share experiences. Our goal there is to sort of help produce materials, perhaps toolkits that can help managers, and we can, add value back, and, make that experience consistent for community members, but also give community managers some sort of tools and ways of avoiding the kind of burnout and stresses and the issues that we've discussed on this webinar, and I'm sure most of you have experienced. So that's our kind of our long-term view. So just to remember, just to kind of sum up the webinar, I guess, community management is a profession, and by this I do mean whether it's a hobby or a career. It is a job with boundaries. It's got a start, it's got an end, and it has to strike a balance with the rest of your life. It feels sometimes like we don't have that start and end, but I think we have to come together as community managers and really work on the fact that, we're human beings, we have our own lives to lead. And then how we work together to manage our communities, in my opinion, will be the key to dealing with mental health in online spaces. We need to remove the isolation of community managers working on their communities and not knowing where to go for help, not being able to share experiences and stories, and not being able to find out what other community managers are doing in this space. For me, this is kind of the crux of where community management needs to focus a big part of its remit on for this year and beyond. And I hope that kind of resonates with a lot of you in terms of your experiences of your communities, and maybe how we can help each other work together to eradicate some of these issues, or certainly make them better in terms of what we're experiencing at the moment. So I think that's pretty much it from us and Richard. We're just come over 45 minutes. So I realise there's a lot of content for everyone to get there. I'm sure the mix of people on the call and just the mix of stuff we've covered in the webinar, some will maybe resonate more with other people. But if we could just hand it over to Nancy and Michael now to sort of collate some of the questions that have been coming up, and feel free to post questions in the window, and Rich and I will happily take 10-15 minutes now to talk about them. And then also just to say, just a reminder, let's continue the conversation in Michael and Nancy's group afterwards. So we don't want this to stop here. We want this to be the stepping stone to other things. So Nancy?
Yeah, great. Thank you both. There's not one specific question for you, but I do encourage all of you. There's lots have been sharing their stories, which
well, stories are good. We can talk about those.
Yeah, which supports what you're saying, that we need a space to do that. And there's some interest for the Lone Ranger, so I'm going to send that link to the blog. Obviously, everyone will get the slides, but that specifically. And then I request, if you want to do that, let us know, and we'll set that up. For me, just one question would be the slide you had just before this one about, it's a job with boundaries and how sort of managing the time. I think what I would love is to help that message get across to the senior managers who look after community managers, because sadly, the boundaries may be put up sometimes and they try and log off and finish and things, and then something will happen overnight and then they get it in the net for not dealing with it. Whereas the problem really is resource, like you talked earlier about the 24 hours. So, for me, if there's any advice on how to help, people have those conversations would be helpful, because I think one statistic might be good is the burnout rate of community managers. Like, I don't have that, but I would love to know that, because that might help. Recruiting and hiring people is an expensive thing. So if I could confirm by looking after the resource properly could reduce that burnout, that would be really, really helpful. But I don't expect you to be able to answer that.
Well, I can feel that a little bit, Nancy. So I think there's a few things here. So, we touched on you kind of, if you're lucky enough to got to a point where you've got a super user group, a lot of those users will be on random times that you're not. And especially, in the early hours of the morning, people are still around, still doing things. If you've got resource, being able to use just the geographic differences in time around the world, certainly that can be a factor. And in terms of your senior stakeholders, I think still there's a lack of connection between the two. But it's not just senior stakeholders. A lot of the time it's other departments in your company. So one thing that I've advised before and people have found quite effective is, this seems a bit weird to say this, and some people, it won't work for everyone, but sometimes just invite yourself into a meeting of a different department, and just with the proviso, you're not going to say anything, you're not going to contribute anything, you're just there to learn. And a lot of the time, it also helps you understand what other departments are doing and where their priorities are. And I think as community managers, in my opinion, the community should be the heartbeat of most organisations. I think a lot of organisations aren't quite there yet or don't quite see that, even though they see maybe the values down the road. But it's understanding a bit more about what we can give back to the other departments in our company. And I think that helps facilitate the conversation about what communities managers are doing. Quite often I hear this story where, a community manager will go for a coffee in the kitchen and someone from marketing or legal or something walks in. It's like, oh yeah, you're the community manager. Yeah, I am. Yeah, how's it all going? Yeah, it's going fine. And there's just like a big silence where they're not quite sure how to sort of deal with you or how to chat about that. So, being able to sort of understand what they're doing as well, maybe how the work that you're doing can feed into them. And then, the other thing is just sort of share some of the stories, this type of stuff we're doing now. A lot of organisations have great success sending out like a Friday missive, an email, or just doing a quick stand-up every so often, or, tell the stories from your community and what's going on, because it should never be a closed door. Community should never feel like it's a department out on its own. So there's maybe a few ideas coming to get. We won't solve everyone's problems. I know there's a lot more work we can do under the surface, but I think just doing things that can proactively maybe just bring down those walls can be quite effective for a lot of people.
Divide and conquer, I like it.
Divide and conquer, that's it, Nance.
And one of the questions from James was he'd love to, I think, talk more, but the challenge is sharing this sort of stuff in a public space. So he would want to have the security to know that what we're sharing is just between us. So I don't know if that's part of your setup process for what you've just been describing.
Yeah,
obviously on LinkedIn is very open.
Yeah, I mean, we will be developing a space. There will be a private space for community managers to come and do this stuff. I think. Sorry, was it James that made the point?
Yeah, James, and then Vincent. Vince is probably offering that. I think straight after he might be able to help you with that. Privately.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, it's something that I think is important. It's a really good question. I think we need to have. I think also it needs to be non-judgmental. So we need to know that when we're talking about these issues, it's a discussion, and it can be frank discussion, but the idea is driving us towards something positive. Sometimes, you see these kind of things happen on LinkedIn or maybe some Facebook groups or whatever. People kind of pile in, it derails the thread, or, you feel like you're being shot at a little bit sometimes. And again, it's just that lack of maybe confidence sometimes for people to talk about these issues. So I think, between the work that we're doing and, people like Vince have got great platforms as well, we can kind of create these great spaces to do that in. But I think it's important to get the conversation started.
Yeah, well, even some of our meetups, Nancy, sort of our little groups we meet up in London. I know it's only London, but we've also got the northeast one as well. Just having that little conversation, having that shoulder to cry on, seems to be quite a common thing that we get out of those little group meetings we have.
It's very cathartic to be in a room full of people that know exactly what you do and know the pain point. You start a sentence rather than having to explain it. Everyone gets it.
I've seen people's shoulders lift. People just go, "Oh, thank God you've been through this as well." And you just, So, and I would also advise anyone on the call that is around either the Northeast or the London meetup. They are very informal. It's only for a couple of hours. It's a nice social as well. But you do meet some great people, and as we all know, community exists in brilliant places. And just the stories people have got and the carbon experiences they're going through are just fantastic. One of Richard and I's connections that came through one of Nancy's groups that has been really useful to us in terms of dealing with some of the sort of mental health issues and learning more about communities happened at one of these meetups. So if you have the time and you can get along, please do, because they're quite useful.
I was just thinking though, Nancy, it strikes me, and this might relate to what James is saying, that establishing a community where the purpose is for people to feel completely free to talk about, even the meetups are in a particular public place, aren't they? And there may be things that you wouldn't want to say, even with sensible drinking. I think it's a really good point, and I think someone has posted about a private Facebook group. I think Darren and I have had recent experience in that sense, where I think it would be better to sort of kind of remove it as best we can from all of those potential influences. But it certainly needs to have that boundary around it where people do feel absolutely safe to think about and disclose things that they may feel very uncomfortable in knowing.
Definitely.
So there's one question that was asked earlier on about some ideas of best practice for running communities online. I know, Darren, you mentioned CMX and Fever Bee, and you got Community Roundtable. Is there any other sort of places people might want to look at?
Well,
Stand on Giants as well.
Yeah, Vince's organisation, Standing on Giants. There are a few Facebook groups out there. There's a Community Manager London group. I mean, what I would say is if everyone kind of, because there's a huge amount of them, those are just...
let's start a conversation. Sorry to interrupt.
Absolutely. What Nancy was about to say, I think let's just start a conversation. So if you guys want to come over to the group, rather than us just trying to reel off tons and tons of them, maybe we'll have a little curation of some of the ones that we think are really good ones. And there's some great courses as well on those. So again, like they won't specifically cover online mental health issues, which is what we're driving towards. But in terms of kind of rounding out your education on communities and how you do these things, and also speak to myself as well. Like myself, Nancy, Michael, we do this stuff for a living. So if we can help out at all, feel free to kind of have that conversation with us as well.
And so one more for me, Darren. You mentioned sort of like you got Rachel and everyone doing like the building side, and I think we had this conversation when we met up like the other week about some types of communities, are not aware that these mental health issues are probably more prominent in their type of community or their style of community, and maybe that's something we need to try and build into the process for the future, that if you are looking to build a community and you're working in a specific area, you're probably more likely to come across some of these issues.
I think that's correct, Michael. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Most of these issues come as a tertiary result of building a great community, and no one ever, in my experience, got into the community management game and went, well, I better learn everything there is to know about mental health and suicide and self-harm, because that's definitely come up once I get past 5 members. That's almost never been the case. But as you grow a successful community, these issues are prevalent. Even in communities like Piston Heads, which is a predominantly male, quite like male-dominated, like driving car community, where you would sort of think like, men don't, maybe traditionally talk about their mental health issues. There's a whole kind of like sub-ethos, substrata of people talking about this stuff. So I think, community managers never see this stuff happening until it's right upon them. And then this causes anxiety in themselves, causes the burnout. So yeah, absolutely, Michael. In terms of the type of stuff I think we can create, I think making community managers aware much more early in the process in terms of their career development and what they're doing, to sort of, pre-armed is pre-warned or whatever, to make them aware that this stuff, might come. It's certainly better than trying to solve everything when it's on top of you and, you're sort of struggling to cope. That's a really good point, yeah.
Right.
Can I just quickly add to that, Nancy?
Yeah.
That I think paradoxically, the safer and the better the community you can build, the more comfortable people will be about talking about the difficult stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
So, it's not just the territory. That's why on Piston Heads, lorry drivers can talk about the stress of driving in London.
Yeah. I'd like to, before we close, there's 2 more questions I'd like to address and then do the closing poll. But all of these questions and thoughts can carry on, if not today, over the coming days. So I don't want people, to feel like, although we're cutting the webinar, I'm going to stop the webinar in a few minutes. Do carry on thinking and talking to each other about this. So 2 last questions. One was from Serena, and I think this is really important, and I see this a lot as a consultant because I try and encourage this, is what steps can we help to take to support someone, perhaps to take a step back for their own well-being. So how do we help them sort of manage their own self-care? Have you had any experience on managing that? And then Vivian would be the last one.
So basically sort of being proactive in terms of helping people help themselves, is that the question?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think, that kind of going back to that personal message and starting the conversation in that way, in a human to human way. We've had times where that has developed into someone saying like, in the news in the UK this week, they've talked a lot about gambling addiction and like, people that find it hard to stop. A lot of people in my experience won't mind you stopping their account. If you say, well, look, how about 24 hours just to cool off? Or 48 hours just to cool off, and like make some recommendations of things they could be doing. Go outside, go and do something else, like go, whatever you're talking to them about their hobbies, you know, give them a reason just to take a break from the community. Because a lot of time it's that sense of perspective. You know, some of the things that people are kind of angry and passionate and excited about in the community, without a sense of context, it kind of closes their world down a little bit. So talk to them about it first, but to sort of say, you know, obviously don't phrase it as a ban, just sort of talk about it as, you know, want to have some time out from the community. And just sort of say, like, you know what we're going to do? We're just going to pause your account. It's not a ban on your account, just a pause on your account. But what I want to do is, you know, in 24 hours, 48 hours, come back and tell me about what you've been doing. Right? Don't just leave it as a closed thing and just hope they get better and it never happens again. I'll ask them about what they're going to do in that time and then talk about what they did. And again, I've been through this process with people. A lot of the time, people come back and say, you know, it was great. I went for a walk. I did small things just to change my perspective. And actually, I sort of realised that thing that I was maybe getting, you know, really stressed about, you know, maybe I can deal with that in a different way.
Yeah.
Also,
can I just ask Nancy, was Serena talking about a member of her team, though?
Yes, yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah, so well, I think Darren's personal message, you know, applies to
same thing, yeah.
Well, you know, noticing someone's not themselves, which you'll pick up in all sorts of ways, might be that icebreaker to start a conversation. And what, you know, some communities feel like they can be radioactive. Doing something earlier, you know, and keeping your antennae tuned to how your team are functioning seems to me, you know, because the earlier you can pick that up, the better they can bounce back. So hopefully, but, you know, it can be tough.
Yeah, and there's some good advice from James too. Okay, so final question, and I think this will leads really well to all the work that you're both doing, is Vivian's mentioned that the communities could really benefit with some resources about the sort of climate of, you know, of good mental health. So how do you maintain that? What are the targets that they should have? So, you know, not to avoid that burnout, what sort of measures or what sort of tips or actions they could adhere to sustain and maintain the good mental health of everyone involved. So I don't know if there's anything specifically like you've talked about already, having that good self-care, having that moderation, you know, not by one person 24 hours. I mean, you've mentioned some of them.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's my understanding, Vivian, is to try and help people be as resilient as possible in the face of extraordinary and unprecedented changes. So, and of course, some of them, like climate change, you know, fill us all with dread. So I think the best we can do is attend to our biology and our psychology as best we can to be as resilient as possible. But there are some situations where, you know, one can't just look for a straightforward, well, it sounds patronizing, isn't it? But there's no simple sort of happy ending, of course. And so it's about how one learns to live with that. So those tips, you know, are really worth encouraging people to stick with and not sort of fall away into despair.
Just to, I guess, to close out this
uplifting message at the end, isn't it?
But actually, you know, the thing we're talking about doing next is kind of where the gap is. You know, we need to give some people a place to go to talk about this stuff, because they don't have that next step. You know, people can take care of themselves and that can make a huge difference. But again, it's the sharing experience, I think, with people. Hopefully what we're going to kind of hopefully carry on this into is maybe the sort of longer term answer there.
Yeah.
We don't want to be silenced. Yeah.
No, exactly. And there's some great comments from Christy and James, and yeah, just really great chat from all of you today. So thanks
to Christy for I've seen what Twitter's been going. Christy's been our official tweet, I think, tweeted. So thanks, Christy, for your efforts on that. Yeah,
thanks, Christy, for all of your great support over the last year. So we're going to draw the webinar to a close. I've popped up the final poll to just get a sense check of how you're feeling after today's content. We will share the slides and the recording with you afterwards, and yeah, please join the discussion on the group, particularly about the resources to help Keith and others. So thank you, Richard and Darren, I was going to say Richard and Graham then, sorry, Richard and Darren, for your great contribution and preparation and just making us all think differently about this topic. I think it's going to change many of us and many of our thoughts about this. We will hopefully hear from many of you next month on the next webinar, but if not, keep the connections going and don't be alone. You know, this is I love communities, and I just want us to practice what we preach and help connect as a profession as well. So let me end the poll. You've had a great response from everyone today, and we look forward to hearing from you again. Thanks, guys. Thanks.
And that's just quickly. There's a final slide here that just gives some contact info.
Yeah.
So, let's continue the discussion in LinkedIn. But if you guys want to reach out through any of the channels and talk about any of these issues, we'd be happy to give our time. Yeah,
and I'll copy you in on the thing so that everyone should have your details. So please reach out to these guys. They're valuable.
And thanks everyone for turning up.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks everyone. Take care.
Cheers.
Bye-bye. Bye.